Hello and welcome to a new edition of Book Review. Today what I want to look at is the question of minority, and it's mainly through this book called Minority Studies, edited by the sociologist Rowena Robinson. And what I'll be talking about today is mainly the introduction to this book, Minority Studies. Minority is a category that's very important for you in many answers, both in general studies, also in the general essay, and indeed in your optional if you are doing any of the social sciences. So what is the minority in India, in a democracy like India? What is the minority in general? And what do we need to understand about minority studies or minority politics that will help us in our answers? So the first thing that Rowena Robinson does is to show you that in the Indian context, the idea of minority is synonymous with religion. And she tracks first briefly the international understandings of minority and indeed minority studies. She locates this in the 1990s with, for example, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, with debates around multiculturalism, and of course debates around immigrant rights. And this, in many ways, is the context for the growth of minority studies in the United States or in the Anglo-American world in general, but also in Europe. But in India, it's had a slightly longer and a more complicated and more interesting history. This history she locates again in three major stages or three major moments that she marks. One is the Constituent Assembly debates, around the formation of India in many ways. The second is the question of reservations and the Mandal moment in some sense. And the third is the moment of Hindutva, which is in many ways the moment we are living in now, but that can be located back to the 1990s. The point she makes is that in many ways she doesn't spend very much time discussing the category minority and actually what it means theoretically and philosophically, which is unfortunate. But she starts by talking about the nation state and saying that the nation state is fundamentally homogenizing in its impulse, and it produces minorities even as it assimilates minorities into its larger ambit. The liberal state, she marks, protects minorities, and it's largely the liberal state that has come up with a discourse about minorities. But she also says that there are strict limits to the liberal state and its conception of minorities. And she spends a little time talking about Indian critiques of the liberal state that have emerged and that are relevant to us. The first is that of Rajiva Bhargava, the political scientist, whom she talks about in relation to the idea of secularism. And she says Bhargava talks of two kinds of secularism, political secularism and ethical secularism. And political secularism is much more just about recognizing other identities in some sense for political form or just for the idea of recognizing these identities. But true secularism is ethical secularism, where you actually embrace or you engage with difference and with minority communities that are not your own. The other theorist she talks about in relation to minority is Rowena Bajpai and her work that shows how from the time of the Constituent Assembly debates, minority became a category that was linked to special claims and to protective privileges, and that in some sense this was a particular kind of trajectory that led to a particular kind of conception of minority. The third person whose work she talks a little about is the work of the political scientist Shail Mayaram, and her work is on an actual community, it's almost anthropological work, political anthropology, that shows that in fact communities live on the ground in a much more fluid way. Mayaram works on the mayors in Rajasthan and shows that on the ground they work in much more fluid ways, and these categories, Hindu and Muslim and whatever else we want to believe in, are in fact not the categories that exist or obtain on the ground. She then goes on to also make the point that minority as an identity is not fixed in time, that in fact conceptions of minority change over time, and she tracks this in relation to the question of the Muslim minority and how the Muslim minority was made over time, from the time of the debate over separate electorates for Muslims to the codification of Muslim personal law, to, of course, the current moment where the Muslim is, in some sense, almost openly a beleaguered subject within the Indian context. She then talks about the Constitution a bit and talks about the articles within the Constitution that protect the rights of minorities, namely 25, 26, 29, 29(2), and 30. She talks about these constitutional provisions as doing something that is a little bit complicated. On the one hand, it actually recognizes religious identities. On the other hand, it secures the commitment of those identities to the nation state. And that is the dual move that the Constitution effects. She then goes on to talk about the three major categories of minority in the Indian context: religious minorities, SCs, and STs, and says that for all of them, in many ways, cultural rights were guaranteed, whereas more substantial political rights were denied. And again, you can see this as part of that same duality in some sense, where cultural rights were given, but substantive political rights were denied. And this is seen very clearly in the anti-conversion rhetoric that exists from Gandhi downwards, that the fear is of outside religions that in some sense might dilute the majoritarian religion. And also it is seen in the question of reservations not being given to Muslims and Christians. There's a PIL in the Supreme Court at the moment demanding for reservations for SC/STs of the Christian and Muslim communities, not least because the government's own Ranganath Mishra committee report has shown that they are among the most beleaguered communities and most in need of reservation within the Dalit communities. She then goes on to talk about the third moment. The second moment is, of course, reservations, and that's linked to what I've just been talking about in relation to reservations for Christians and Muslims. But the last is the question of Hindutva, which is, of course, the production of India as a Hindu state and is marked by several moments. The moment of Ayodhya, for example, and the breaking of the Babri Masjid, the moment of the Bombay riots, the moment of Gujarat 2002, and finally the moment of Kandhamal, which is the terrible pogrom against Dalit Christians in Orissa. Finally, she does make a kind of the beginnings of a kind of critique that should have been developed much more in this introduction, which is the critique of gender and how that intersects with minority, and how women have been marginalized, for example, by this cultural autonomy debate. That is, cultural autonomy for minority communities can often militate against women's rights. And she shows this in relation to the Shah Bano case, in which the fight was really between the rights of Shah Bano, an older Muslim woman who was denied alimony, and the rights of the community of Muslims as a whole. And as we know, the community question won. Could be argued for electoral gains and whatever else, but the fact is that cultural minorities as a whole tend to subjugate gender rights. But there are several other kinds of rights that the category minority tends to subjugate. For example, in the very characterization of the category minority, what are the kinds of groups that, for example, Rowena Robinson herself as a sociologist does not even signpost as not being part of the minority question, which should have been part of the minority question? For example, let's think of several categories that are missing from her conception of minority. Where is the sexual minority, for example? Is the sexual minority not a minority category, especially one denied rights by the state? In fact, not even recognized by the state, not even rendered legible by the state in the way in which ST, and SC are. What about the rights of disabled people? Are disability rights not part of our understanding, or should they not be part of our understanding of minority? What about sex worker rights, especially in relation to the recent anti-trafficking bill that now sex worker groups and many other groups have been strongly protesting against, though it may be too late? What about the rights of nomadic communities, not all of whom are ST, many are OBC? What about their rights? What about the rights of Kashmiris? What about the rights of Northeasterners? What about the rights of informal laborers that may form a majority in terms of the economy but are a minority in terms of rights of laboring groups? They have the least rights. So all of these categories are missing from Rowena Robinson's conception of minority, but also women as a whole, not just to make the point that women's rights get subordinated under the category minority, but are women to be seen as a minority as well, is the kind of question we need to ask, because though they may constitute technically half of the population, though of course that is also not the case, and indeed women's population is dwindling thanks to our bias against the girl child, but do we conceive of women as a minority category at all? But also deeper theoretical questions about what constitutes the minority. And there are many, many interesting debates around the question of minority, whether it is Karl Marx on the Jewish question, whether it is Hannah Arendt on the Jewish question. We've had some very, very interesting debates since at least the 19th century on the question of minority. And so these are the kinds of questions we need to think about and that are unfortunately missing from this introduction to minority studies by Rowena Robinson. But it's a good book to look at. There are several essays by different authors in the book on different categories. We'll do some of these essays in subsequent videos, but this was a video to just get you to start thinking about the category minority. Thank you.